He's the chair of the Standing Committee of Microbiological Hygiene at the IDF, the International Dairy Federation. And I think he knows Professor Marelli very well. I will leave that to him. The presentation will discuss the importance and the awareness for scientists in their plight to create next-level paradigms and categories and their relevancy in what is suggested, researched, and published, and can and may have significant impacts on regulations, the industry, and eventually consumers. So these challenges should not be taken lightly, and this next presentation will touch on that and some of the work that's beginning in that field. Please welcome François Bourdichon.
Thank you, George. My apologies to the Lazio fan club section of Lorenzo Borelli, but he was retained by the Emilia-Romagna section of the fan club and had to leave earlier. Usually, always two they are, the master and the apprentice, and this time you get the apprentice. And I must say that I was allowed by Lorenzo to use this Star Wars quote, but not using a Yoda and Luke Skywalker picture. You can't get it all. So the talk is to think about 20 years after the FAO WHO guidelines, what's next? For those who were in the Aula Magna yesterday, you already know the answer. That's the Roma criteria in the next 2 years. I discovered this easier, so I think I know my planning for the next 2 years. But that's another point. So it's quite a tradition within Roma to discuss about these guidelines. There was already a topic on the 6th edition in 2011. And the point is to remember which document we're speaking with. There was one which was written in 2001 in Cordoba, Argentina, following a trade issue between Argentina and Brazil about milk powder with active bacteria sold from Argentina to Brazil. And there was his first expert report. The second one was in London, not UK, but Ontario, Canada. And this document has been compiled in 26 in the FAO Nutrition Paper 85. And as we are in Rome, Professor Morelli asks you to be careful with the etymology. It's written the two documents that the word probiotic comes from Greek in 2001, in 2002, which is not the case. The word probiotic is a mixture of Latin, pro, in favor of, and Greek, bio, life. And it means in favor of, because in ancient Greek, pro means before. And this is a topic of advice for PhD students. If you want to explain your PhD supervisor that he was present in 2001 and 2002 and should have seen the error, keep it for yourself. It's not a good idea. The boss is always right. About the milestone of the presentation, the point is to discuss about what's defined in definition. And as discussed in previous talks, this is not easy because everything starts with the definition. If you don't know what you're talking about, the rest is just a logorrhea of your ID, but it doesn't bring anything to the discussion. So you must establish a definition. It's easier said than done, and you must qualify it, provide quantification components, some things that make it meaningful. A little bit of history, a book which is not as old as the IDF, I did mention. This one is the translation from 1908 from Mitchell, The Prolongation of Life. And come back to the source, the real title in French is Essai Optimiste, not Prolongation of Life. Prolongation of Life is only the chapter 4 within the document. And Elias Metchikov was not that happy with the translation. So whenever you want to refer to this book, don't use the English title, use the French one. As a former Pasteurian, I really insist on this one. The real Metchnikov ideas were first proposed in The Nature of Mind, 1905, where it supported that the colon, as an organ, could be either useless or even dangerous. Remember that he was a medical doctor. It was very difficult by then to say who was microbiologist, who was not. And the bacteria of the colon for Metchnikov were perceived, that's the term used, as agent of putrefaction, which means that in order to get things in order, you should acidify your colon using lactic acid or lactic fermentation. And he slightly moved a little bit with a more opportunistic approach in the Essai Optimiste of 1905, which was published in 1907. In fact, that people are different susceptibility, and you should maybe have a look on the microbiota of people. And it's pretty interesting to read this book. It's available in PDF, either in English or the French version. But all the discussion we have right now with inactivated cells, dead cells, is already a point that this first explorer of the science did more than a century ago. And they said that it should be solved. Unfortunately, more than a century after, it's still not solved. So it means that it's not that easy. The concept seems pretty fine. But when you deal with such a pleiotropic approach, it's difficult to see really what makes sense when you try to understand behind. About probiotic as well, the terms has evolved a lot, which is normal. A definition is not meant to stay forever, apart maybe the table of Moses, that's another one. But for the definition, it has to evolve because the science changed, because the vision that you have about it changed. And he come back to the definition. One of the first that really made sense and pretty aligned with today's approach was the one from Fuller in 1989. And this is where a qualification is introduced in the definition, that how do you substantiate what you want to say behind this organism. And there were a bunch of definition people. Lorenzo told me this morning, don't go into this one, they might all fall asleep. The presentation will be shared, but that's for you to explain that you see between Parker and Guarner, there have been a lot of proposals. The issue is that when you evolve the science, you try to define what you're speaking about, and it's not that easy. When the concept evolves, the definition has to evolve. That's what we've seen recently with the COVID-19 crisis. The more we learn, the more we see that we don't know exactly what's going on. So be ready to change. There is always a need to be precise, to make some qualification. Once you define the concept, so in the Codex Alimentarius, we always speak of components. Here in this document, the technical meeting on prebiotics from 27, they explain the different qualification. And it's really important when you try to work on this topic, or you try to promote that you will have a probiotic microorganism that indeed you can qualify what's going on. And in 2001, there were some proposals in the scope to define really what we are speaking about, what is part of the discussion, what is not part. Point of note, the document as such in 2001-2002 was meant for food, which means that by design they exclude biotherapeutic agents and the beneficial microorganism not used in food. We are changing a little bit because now the proposal is used for food supplement, which is not per se food. But there have been a lot of discussion. Does really the interaction between the microorganism and the food make sense? Sometimes it does, sometimes it don't. Not all the probiotics that have been used on the food chain does have really fermentative properties. Some are just added on the food matrix, some are part of the elaboration of the food matrix. In terms of the other points, you must also have always this debatable point. Some agree, some don't, that the microorganism should be able to survive through the digestive tract, which means in a nutshell, you need to find this in the poop at some points. But the question is, finding it how? Which techniques? Does it have to be alive, cultivable? The presence should only be there? Which techniques do you use? In 2001, 2002, the technique were mostly culture-based. So that's on a petri dish. We're in 2021, we have other techniques to see what's present, what's active. Flow cytometry, for example, genomic techniques, and other points. There was also this point highlighted in the initial guidelines that everything is strain related. This one is pretty good because there is no definition of a strain. Not so clear definition of the species, but if you have the taxonomist of the IUMS, strain is not defined. If you ask for a pathogenic food safety microbiologist, we agree that a microorganism can change over the years. When we have a Listeria or Salmonella staying for 20, 25 years in a factory, we know that there are changes in the genome. That's still the same strain for us. When you have people in the food industry who provide starters, food cultures, or probiotics, they don't like mutation. It's not the same strain for them. Which means that depending who you ask, strain is a different concept. Nevertheless, you have it in the document. Deal with it. Mostly with whole genome sequencing right now, how many SNPs do you allow in terms of changes on your microorganism? One thing's interesting in this document, the arrow is missing. Not really. It's not there on purpose. As you can see, phase 3 is for the effectiveness on specific treatment or specific condition. You're not dealing with a probiotic anymore, which means that if you target your clinical study for a specific population, this is not a probiotic anymore, because this is medical purpose, this is specific purpose. You have a different also regulation for the production. You end up in the GMPs, global manufacturing practices, from the pharma grade, and not anymore the food safety management scheme, which you have classically in the food industry. So the intention of use, as was discussed this morning, is very important in the regulatory bodies to decide where you're going to classify your product. For probiotic food, phase 3 are not part of it. In terms of qualification, there have been a lot of survey in the previous years. I had a discussion this morning with one person in the room who tells me that if we do the survey today, we still have the same issue that we had 10, 20 years before, that there is a lot of unsubstantiation in what should be present in the supplement or in the food products. Have in mind that when we speak about rejection of the claim from EFSA, most of the claims were rejected from the start because the strain was not characterized. So it was not even questioned that the science was not, no, it was not characterized. What's supposed in the product is not there. Come back when you have more substantiation of what really you claim to have. So this was a different publication as well, and there was the need for improved quality control, which is something which is close to the heart of Lorenzo, more qualification. Qualification, nevertheless, is not that easy. When you speak with a different microorganism, you need also to define for which purpose will it be, and does you still stay in the food categories. Going back to one of the points also that we've been fighting a lot in the past 20 years at the IDF is about accurate taxonomy. Lactobacillus sporogenes does not exist. I repeat, Lactobacillus sporogenes does not exist. This is not a valid taxon. And you have to be very careful in using names, Latin names, which are not the last one. Having said that, that's one of the issues that you have with the taxonomy changing pretty fast. Most of you are aware of the publication of Zheng et al. About the revision of the Lactobacillus genera, which was quite of a mess for the global labeling of all the food products. But you need to keep with this. But it's always interesting when you are asked to review draft standards of different regulation country, and you still find lactic acid bacteria as an example of accurate taxonomy, which it is not. So that's something to be careful with. The concept of probiotic has evolved. Using the recent publication from the ISAP, there was also the point that maybe, in fact, when you look at the evidence, everything is not only strain related, which means that it doesn't change the definition, but it changes the criteria behind, which means that that's something that is a bit complicated to get an agreement internally to the IDF. Maybe the definition, we believe, doesn't need a revision, but the guideline does. The only thing we agreed was, at the end, was to maintain the definition. For the guidelines, we're still fighting, discussing. There are many reasons for this. Is that regulation at some point need to be enforced, need to take place, and they take decision based on the level of science available when they make this revision, and also something that we ask regularly is for revision of the regulation. We have this example with Italy. We have a recent example in 2017 for fermented foods with China, who has a positive list of microorganisms. Most of the food cultures that you find in European food were not present in this list of China, which dated from 2010. It was mostly forgotten by the authorities. But there was one consumer association who blamed the government not to do the job and letting dangerous food, Danish blue cheese, Gorgonzola, and Roquefort, entering the Chinese market. I can ensure when you're not trained, indeed, this food can be dangerous. But anyway, we end up with a blockage, and right now we are working a lot with China to update the regulation and making them understand that, yes, science evolves, you need to have some consideration, and having a frame which is too rigid is also an issue to trade. And when we speak of all these points, the organization behind is the World Trade Organization. So if you take too stringent regulation position, you can end up in trade wars, and this can be scaled up to the World Trade Organization. Whoever believes food is not political is wrong, by the way. And there was also a lot of discussion for further step for non-specific claims. So this one is the Italian example. I don't know, there is a bias in Lorenzo is always using example from Italy, but he also used Canada, and we have also this example with Spain, with the Netherlands, with Danes. There are lots and lots of member states within Europe who had to take position because there is no global position taken by the European Commission. At some point it will be needed because this could be seen as a trade issue within the European Commission that not all the member states have the same rules, and also in terms of protection of the consumer. There is also the point that in the FAO WHO definition we were only considering probiotics for food, but now 20 years after, food is not only meant for, probiotics is not only meant for food but also for food supplement product over the counter. So there is really a need to have a work behind the guidelines. There must also be careful in too much generated science, which does not mean that it's always good science. I'm not saying that we don't produce good science here, but as I mentioned yesterday, the world is big and you have plenty of opportunistic players outside. So it's not enough to do the jobs right, you have to make sure that the other plays with the rules. It's not always the case. If you want to speak about food fraud, we can be there for plenty of time. This about children, grandchildren, and daddy and mama probiotics, that's coming from him. I'm not fully positive about it, but what is important is when you have a look at the total publication, it can be an issue at some point in the science where you have so many reviews, so many meta-analyses, and not necessarily a lot of publication and clinical trials behind, which means that you go around in circle, you satisfy yourself with a lot of publication, but not everything does make sense. So it's important to provide consistency in the science and to make sure that we don't turn up in circles years after years. And in terms of to be successful with too much terms can be different. If you have a number of mention, does not mean necessarily there is a lot of substantiation behind. So be careful, and that's something you need to know if you are in secourism and providing people. It's not the one who cried the most loudest which needs assistance. Sometimes it's the one who doesn't speak at all. So have a look. The indicator of citation is not necessarily relevant. It's an indication, but it's not enough. You need to have a look as well how many predatory articles behind this and how many, let's say, scientists will use several times the same words and in fact generate echoes on their own work. It's not that easy. As for the reference for 3 men in a boat, I have no idea. That's one of the issues of taking someone else's presentation. I didn't read the book, so there must be something beyond, but I don't know. So I should have asked Lorenzo before he left. What is important is to see that we have a lot of concepts behind, and that's a point of discussion we had on Saturday. Some remain scientifically based and make sense. Some can be used indeed to promote a more clear signal to the consumer. Does not mean per se that they are used in scientific reviews. And some don't make sense at all. I'll let you find here in this different concept which one are scientifically based but still remains explanation. That will be paraprobiotic and postbiotic. We need to clarify this. Microbiotic is not substantiated at all. Skin biotics and psychobiotics is not science per se, but for the consumer it's interesting to understand. And as long as we know that we speak of probiotics with different effects, it could be acceptable. I don't say I do. I said it has to be considered, but it depends also where and when you use these terms. Because what you need to know, so Rosanna provided a very clear example as well. Lorenzo has others, and I think if we want to find all the examples where probiotic is clearly misused, we could make a book. But the point is, putting in place regulation will help have supervision and will make sure that you get protected. Because as scientists here present, you generate a lot of science, but if the science cannot be protected and you cannot make sure that others won't make bad use of it, you're losing your time and your money. So be careful with this. I know that people don't like a frame because it's a synonym of a cage, but sometimes it's good to put some barriers. But if you want to play on the other side of the hurdle, just jump. But it might be a jungle outside. One example for the measurable qualification of unviable bacteria, that's pictures that you can find with MIT microscopy electrotransmission. Sometimes the bacteria are not in the shape that you expect them to be. This one seems clearly dead. And she did not answer to the signal. And this is one of the issues and one of the things that has been worked out with the Ministry of Health in Italy when they worked about defining a criteria for shelf life, for total plate count at the end of shelf life. So they put as a criteria that any food, any probiotics product, whether food or feed supplement, should contain at the end of shelf life 10 to the 8. And as you can see, that the product on the left is the product at the start of shelf life. Everything's all right, it's going great. At the end of shelf life, some are slightly broken. I try to be on time, 1 minute. Yeah, before you shoot me. So it's important to get QC parameter in place. Are they relevant? Scientifically, no. But for monitoring, it might be good enough. So that's also something you must get. You are a scientist who've got very brilliant idea, but you are maybe too highly skilled for routine analysis. So you must also translate this in evidence that can be used fast, cheap, and by many laboratories. So I know that biomass as QC parameter can be scientifically discussed, but if it's good enough to slightly clear the market and get things in order, maybe it's not so irrelevant. To give you an example, for many years, for UHT milk, we have been using total plate count. Now we know it's not the best indicator, but it served us well. Now we're trying to change the criteria. It will take some time, but we're getting to it. But at some point, science needs to be translated in routine application. And what is important is not to lose the consumer in this maze, or mess, it depends on the French accent, which I can force. Not only losing the consumer, but don't lose yourself as well. That's the point I really want to highlight. You're scientists, be careful with the terms you use, with the terms you see used, and also when you're a reviewer, make sure that you don't end up with publication where you say, well, that's okay, that's not perfect, but I will let it go. No, your job is sometimes to say to the people who submit the publication that they need to be strict with the words. So as take-home message, 20 years after, the I is Lorenzo, but I agree with this, of course. We need an international effort to avoid confusion, to provide definitions able to generate standards. Slightly rings like a bell as presented yesterday, but indeed that's also why we decided to have a group of experts gathered and launch the initiative. Having said that, thanks for your attention, Biotics. That's his joke. Mine will be that take a sip of aquabiotics, a good oxybiotics, and everything will be all right.